Welcome to this then, our second video on Ackoff's paper Towards a System of Systems Concepts. In the first video we looked at the definition of a system. In this video we'll be looking at the notion of system changes. In order to understand change in systems, we need to understand the notions of reaction, response, and acting. Understanding these three concepts will also require us to understand conditionals, or the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions. Let's start by reading Ackoff's definitions. A reaction of a system is a system event for which another event that occurs to the same system or its environment is sufficient. Thus, a reaction is a system event that is deterministically caused by another event. This is the same as saying that A causes B. For example, if an operator's moving a motor switch is sufficient to turn that motor off or on, then the change of state of the motor is a reaction to the movement of its switch. In this case, the turning of the switch may be necessary as well as sufficient for the state of the motor. But an event that is sufficient to bring about a change in a system state may not be necessary for it. For example, sleep may be brought about by drugs administered to a person, or it may be self-induced. Thus, sleep may be determined by drugs, but need not be. A response of a system is a system event for which another event that occurs to the same system or to its environment is necessary but not sufficient. That is, a system event produced by another system or environmental event, in other words, the stimulus. Thus, a response is an event of which the system itself is a co-producer. A system does not have to respond to a stimulus, but it does have to react to its cause. Therefore, a person's turning on a light when it gets dark is a response to darkness. But the lights going on when the system is switched on is a reaction. Of course, the system may have chosen not to react. An act of a system is a system event for the occurrence of which no change in the system's environment is either necessary or sufficient. Acts, therefore, are self-determined events, autonomous changes. Internal changes in the states of the system's elements are both necessary and sufficient to bring about action. Much of the behavior of human beings is of this type, but such behavior is not restricted to humans. A computer, for example, may have its state changed or change the state of its environment because of its own program. In order to understand these concepts, it's going to be best to look at a couple of examples, because they can be confusing without clarifying exactly what is meant by both necessary and sufficient. In effect, Ackoff here, in summary, is talking about the nature of causal relationships, and these relationships are interpreted in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. In summary, with necessity, the outcome of an event is a subset of the causal condition, while with sufficiency, the causal condition is a subset of the outcome. This leads us into the area of Boolean logic, and Boolean logic is a very important part of programming and really revolves around the basis of statements, conditional statements, if and then statements. This is a very nice overview of necessary and sufficient conditions by Norman Swartz from the Department of Philosophy at Simon Fraser University. Everyone is familiar with the concept of a necessary condition. For example, we all know that air is necessary for human life. Without air, there is no human life. Similarly, a microscope, or any other instrument, is necessary for human beings to see viruses, because viruses are too small to be seen by the naked eye. People are also familiar with the concept of a sufficient condition. For example, it suffices, i.e., it is sufficient for an object having 4 sides to be a square. However, both of these conditions require clarification. Let's look at another definition of a necessary condition. A condition A is said to be necessary for condition B if and only if the falsity, or the non-existent non-occurrence of A guarantees or brings about the falsity or non-existence of B. Notice this does not prove truthfulness, but falsity. Here are a number of examples. Air is necessary for human life, is not necessarily sufficient. Human beings must have air to live. If we look at this in the form of an if-then statement, then the clause that follows the then, the so-called consequence, states the necessary condition for the antecedent, i.e. the clause immediately following the if. Thus, that some human being has air to live is a necessary condition for that human being's being alive. Let's look at it through a number of examples. A microscope or a similar instrument is needed to see viruses. You could restate it in a different way. Human beings must have a microscope to see viruses. In the form of an if statement, you may put it in the following way. If someone sees viruses, then that person uses a microscope. All of these statements are necessary conditions. But of course, as we well know in general, a necessary condition is not a sufficient condition. All sorts of conditions may be necessary for others, but they do not by themselves suffice for or guarantee those others. Let's clarify this by looking at the definition of a sufficient condition. A condition A is said to be sufficient for a condition B if and only if the truth, the existence or occurrence of A guarantees or brings about the truth or existence of B. For example, while air is a necessary condition for human life, it is by no means a sufficient condition, i.e. it does not by itself, i.e. alone, suffice for human life. While someone may have air to breathe, that person will still die if she lacks water, has taken poison, is exposed to extremes of cold or air. There are in fact a great many conditions that are necessary for human life, and no one, or even just a few of them, will suffice for or guarantee human life. Or, further, consider the property of having 4 sides. While having 4 sides is a necessary condition for something being a square, that single condition on its own is not sufficient to guarantee that something is a square. There are several necessary conditions for something being a square, and all of these must be satisfied for something's being a square. For example, x has exactly 4 sides, each of x's sides is straight, x is a closed figure, x lies in a plane, etc., etc. Thus, the foregoing is a set of necessary conditions, i.e. the set comprises a set of sufficient conditions for x being a square. If we go back to our previous slide, you can see this stated here again. With necessity, the outcome is a subset of the causal condition. Thus, A causes B. A may well cause other conditions, but A necessarily causes B. With sufficiency, the causal condition is a subset of the outcome. So frequently, the terminology individually necessary and jointly sufficient is used. For example, one might say, each of the members of the foregoing set is individually necessary, but taken all together they are jointly sufficient for x being a square. With these notions, one must exercise caution, because you may be able to list a set of individually necessary conditions that are sufficient for something's being a square. However, you cannot generalize from the simple example and believe that it is usually or always a straightforward task to specify the conditions that are individually necessary and jointly sufficient. Sometimes it is much easier to specify some or many of the necessary conditions, even though we are unable to specify a set that is jointly sufficient. Other times, the opposite is true, for in some cases it will be easier to specify sufficient conditions without our being able to specify individual necessary ones. So once again, this goes back to the idea that it depends on the goal or the outcome of the system which conditions are necessary and which are sufficient. Here is an example of necessary conditions that are not sufficient. In other words, a set of conditions that are individually necessary without being jointly sufficient. For example, this is an example taken from elsewhere about a Walkman and being able to listen to music. There are a number of necessary conditions. The Walkman is in good working order, the batteries are good, or if you check the note, you should have some form of electricity supply or power supply. The earphones are plugged in, the tape has music on it, and it is in good working condition. Also, you need to operate the controls correctly. Now, of course, nowadays we can substitute the word iPod or music player for Walkman. This, of course, is a slightly dated example. So, this person initially made the hasty claim that taken all together they are sufficient. Unfortunately, this list by no means is sufficient. Here are just a few of the many additional necessary conditions that must be given. A. The listener must not be deaf. The ambient surrounding sound must not drown out the earphones. There must be nothing blocking the sound in the listener's ears, etc., etc. So sometimes, as in this case, it is far easier to specify necessary conditions than sufficient ones. In other words, you may not be able to specify all of the conditions. Now, you may well be forgiven for being confused when trying to understand the relationship between necessity and sufficiency. This is partly because of the dual relationship between the two. For example, a condition can be either necessary or sufficient without being the other. For instance, being a mammal is necessary but not sufficient to being human, and a number x is rational is sufficient but not necessary to x as being a real number, since they are real numbers that are not rational. A condition can be both necessary and sufficient. For example, today is the 4th of July is a necessary and sufficient condition, for today is Independence Day in the United States. So perhaps the best way to examine the relationship between these entities is to look at the two most basic logic circuits in Boolean logic, these being the AND and OR gates. Digital systems are constructed by using logic gates, and there are a number of these, but the two most basic are the AND and OR gates. Digital systems are constructed by using logic gates. Below you can see the AND gate and the OR gate. Both of these circuits have two inputs, A and B, and produce an output. In the case of the AND gate, it is necessary for both A and B to be true in order to get an output of true. In other words, A must be on and B must be on in order for the gate to give you a true output. It is necessary for A to be on, but not sufficient, because it is also necessary for B to be on. It is only when both are on at the same time that it is sufficient to cause the output AB. When one examines the operation of the OR gate, you can see that it gives an output of true under 3 different scenarios. Either when A is true or when B is true. Thus, A is sufficient to cause the output of true. Also, B is sufficient to cause the output of true. However, A is not necessary to cause the output true if B is true, and conversely, B does not necessarily have to be true to cause the output of true if A is true. Thus, you can see the relationship here between necessary and sufficient. It is sufficient for A or sufficient for B to be true. Also, A and B could be true to give the output of true. Thus, it is necessary for either A or B to be true. Returning then to Ackoff's paper, we can now review the terms reaction, response, and act of a system. And we will do so by turning back to our example that we used previously on the Smart Shopper system. You can see over here that this is a stimulus. User inputs address information, a card swipe, or books being returned. The system thus has 3 separate stimuluses there, as well as a 4th one for ad hoc report requests. The lines that are outputs are then responses to those requests, so they are determined by the actual request, the input or the stimulus. So in the case of the user address information, the system outputs a response that the account is registered, perhaps printing, for example, the Smart Shopper ID. When someone swipes their card, the system will produce the amount of money that the customer is due back, as well as the cash points balance. In other words, it will give the customer a receipt. In terms of auto-generated responses, you can see here that the reporting subsystem is set up to generate reports at timed intervals, and this, in effect, is an act of the system. Thus, we can see that our Smart Shopper system includes all the necessary components and concepts which would characterize it as a system. That brings us to the end of this section of the review of Ackoff's paper, and it is well worth spending some time looking at the Smart Shopper system and seeing if you can identify the various components and concepts within the system that makes it a valid system according to Ackoff's theory.